Thank you, Carol. It's always nice to be asked to talk about thinking abilities in epilepsy. And Carol deserves a lot of credit for organizing this series and the chance to offer services to a whole range of individuals with epilepsy so that they can find out what's out there and what things they can take advantage of. So for the next half hour or so, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about thinking skills in epilepsy. And so my goal for this talk is to help individuals understand what parts of the brain contribute to thinking skills. So it's not just one part of the brain, and how the brain works together to contribute thinking abilities. As well, how does epilepsy affect thinking skills? And so we know that people with epilepsy often experience challenges with thinking. And so let's understand why that is and what we can do to improve thinking in daily life. So one place to start with is just a major topology of the brain. And so the front part of our brain is most important for reasoning and complex attention. And one area that's very common for epilepsy, the temporal lobe, happens to be an important part of our brain for memory and language, especially on the dominant side, the left side. And towards the back and top of our brain, we have our parietal lobe, and that can be an area important for balancing things visual spatially, how well you can do things in terms of your perception. And towards the back is an area that's more important for seeing things. And so that's just a major way that different parts of the brain are more involved with thinking. But at the more granular level, our brain produces cognition by having different neurons or the type of nerve cells in our brain talk to each other. And they talk to each other with both chemicals as well as electricity. And so when we talk about neurotransmitters, those are ways that neurons transmit information from one part of the brain to another by talking through neurons. So neurotransmitters tell different neurons in the brain, we should talk to each other. Let's be friends. Let's talk. And so over shorter distances, they exchange those neurotransmitters, but over longer distances, they communicate with electricity by having that signal transferred from one neuron to another. And so what we see is a network of regions in the brain contributing to cognition. So it's not one neuron, it's a series of neurons, and it's not just a series of neurons, it's a whole network of neurons that allow us to communicate messages where thinking abilities are produced. And so when we think about a network, sometimes it's helpful to think of a symphony where we have on this brain here different nodes, and those nodes are talking to each other in particular ways to produce thought. And so it's important to think about the brain not just as an area, but as a network. And for the younger people, thinking of it like Wi-Fi or as network activation can be helpful. And for us older people, it can be helpful to think of it like a symphony with different musicians who play music in particular ways. And in that way, it's a network of musical activity. And so in epilepsy, unfortunately, what happens is we see disruptions in the brain's normal electrical activities. So many people with epilepsy will be familiar with things called EEGs, and that's an electroencephalogram. And that's a way that we record the brain's electrical activity. And so for a normal EEG, we just see kind of happy rhythms in the brain that are normal and periodic. Whereas unfortunately with epilepsy, when we have a seizure, we see more chaotic activity where there is these electrical outbursts or these periodic sharp waves in particular that point to some sort of disruption in electrical activity. And so it's no wonder that people with epilepsy in general report more thinking challenges because the normal electrical circuitry in our brain is being disrupted by seizures. But it's not even that simple where it's just the electrical currents in our brain being disrupted, but also the medication used to treat epilepsy can make thinking hard. And so the way it works is that if we take a medication, just like that blue pill on your screen, it tells two neurons not to talk to each other. And the reason your epilepsy medications do that is that they want there to be a less likelihood of seizure spread. So By having neurons not talk to each other, that makes it less likely that a seizure will occur. But unfortunately, if neurons aren't talking to each other and transmitting information with neurotransmitters, and then over longer periods over electricity, then that means thinking can be slowed down. So unfortunately, your doctors might be prescribing medications that make seizures less likely, but that also makes thinking more difficult. So I wish it was a different way, but that's unfortunately the relationship that exists. And so when people say to me, Dave, my thinking skills aren't what they used to be ever since I started epilepsy medication, I say, I'm sorry to hear that, but you're in a very large kind of portion of patients with epilepsy who report that. So I looked at the research recently, and between 44 and 59% of people with epilepsy will say, my thinking skills are impaired by my medications to some degree, whether it's a little bit or a lot. People with epilepsy often report that their medications are bad for their thinking. And in fact, around 2/3 of people will say that their anti-epileptic drugs prevent them from achieving goals in life rather than the epilepsy themselves. So it's an unfortunate state of affairs. And so for the rest of the talk, I want to talk about what are things we can do to improve memory and cognition, knowing that that's something we have to accept because we need our medications to reduce the likelihood of seizures. And so we can talk to our doctors about different medications and try to find medications that impact thinking skills as little as possible. But in general, the other class of things we can work on is how can we learn skills to better use our memory or take advantage of our memory skills in daily life. And so what I'll start with is a description of how memory works. So memory isn't just one thing, it's actually a lot of different processes. So in particular, when we talk about shorter term memory, and so that should read short term memory, not short term memory, that refers to memory just as you're holding on to information before it gets encoded into longer term memory. So that could be if you don't have your cell phone in your hand and someone asks you to remember a number, they say 416-705-6261. That's short term memory before you have to remember it over a long period of time, just simply holding on to information. And that is impacted by both epilepsy as well as the medications to treat epilepsy. And that's frustrating. Longer term memory refers to after we're done holding on to that information, what goes into our long term memory stores. And some of that memory is declarative or things we can say out loud, and other types of memory are non declarative. So, non declarative memory could be memory for how to ride a bicycle, how to write, how to do other sorts of activities. If you know how to do a dance move, that's a type of non declarative memory. Whereas declarative memory is memory for the meaning of things or semantic memory. So that could be the memory for facts in the world. So, for instance, if you know that the capital of France is Paris, that's a type of semantic memory. Another type of memory is episodic memory, and this is the most common type of memory that people with epilepsy complain about because it refers to our memory for episodes in our life. So things that have a beginning, middle, and end. So if you have a favorite family vacation or some sort of event you experienced and you're not able to recall it, that would be an episodic memory failure. And so those types of memories can be frustrating to forget because we want to hold on to them. We want to travel back in time and vividly recall an event. And so it can be frustrating when we're unable to remember that. So short-term memory and episodic memory are the two types of memory that are most affected. And then when we think about beyond memory types and go into memory processes, we think about encoding information, and that refers to getting things into memory. We think about storing it, and that is once memory is in our brain, how does it retain its status? And often over sleep, memory is consolidated, and it's something that gets gradually retained over time. We don't do anything to retain information. And then the important process of retrieval is how do we get memory out of our brain and back into our conscious life. And that's going into our memory and being able to say what happened. So if you have the experience of remembering the Leafs game a couple nights ago, in order to retrieve that memory, you have to go back into your consciousness and think, okay, what happened in the Leafs game? And you pull it out. And if you're able to say what happened, you're successfully retrieving the episode of the Leafs game. So we have encoding, storage, and retrieval. And so an important thing to reflect on is, why do we forget? So why not remember everything? Well, that would be nice if we could, but unfortunately memory doesn't work that way. So regardless of if you have epilepsy or not, sometimes memory just simply fades over time. And just like our shoes run out of tread over time, that's just a normal part of life, that some memory fades or some memories won't be as vivid. But the absolute vast majority of memory is disrupted because of interference. And so interference occurs because one memory is similar to another memory and we get confused, or during the process of learning something, we get interrupted, or some sort of disruption like a seizure prevents a memory from being transferred from the retention phase into the retrieval phase, or from the encoding phase to the retention phase. So the vast majority of memories aren't just simply forgotten, they're interfered with or disrupted. But it's still important to remember that some forgetting is normal. So we can't be too frustrated when we forget every once in a while, because even normal younger adults in their 20s or 30s will only retain 80 or 90% of information. So thinking back to what we can do with these memory processes, let's think about strategies we can do to help us get information in and to help get information out. How can we help encoding, and how can we help retrieval? And so there are different things that we can do. And one example of something we could do is being strategic. And so anytime we even think about applying a strategy, we're already increasing the likelihood that we'll remember information. So anytime we add a strategy, we are going to make our memory more memorable. So even if it's a bad strategy, being strategic is still helpful. But we're going to talk about good strategies, and so we're going to be able to learn those by the end. I also encourage people to be creative. If someone tells you a story, that story might be boring, it might be uninteresting. Our job is to make it interesting by adding some creativity, making it funny, making it interesting, making it engaging, making it silly. Be creative and take that otherwise boring information and make it memorable. So that's how we can change normal memories into more exciting, vivid memories. Another recommendation about memory strategies overall is to be organized. So an organized brain is more likely to know where a memory is located, and then it's more likely to be able to find it. So think of a librarian. A good librarian knows where all the books are, and she's able to pull them out and be able to find them when she needs that memory. So let's do a little experiment with numbers. So what happens when we try to remember these numbers? So if I show these to you guys for a little period of time and we're just looking at these numbers, that's a lot of information. It's 12 numbers. It's more than what we can just hold in our shorter term memory just by not even doing anything. And so what could be a strategy to hold on to these numbers over time? Because if you're anything like me, maybe you remember one of those, three of those, five of those. And so one thing we could do is to say, okay, how can I make this boring information meaningful? Maybe some of these numbers going downward are meaningful to you and they remind you of important dates in history, or maybe going across, you read these as different area codes. And these are the different area codes of the different cities I've lived in the last 10 years. So that's how I remember them. So anytime we make that information more meaningful and we encode it and we think, okay, this was New York, this was North Carolina, this is Toronto, this is St. Louis. Once we start to think of them as different area codes, it becomes more memorable and we're more likely to get that into memory and retrieve it back out of memory. So having some sort of meaningful strategy makes the encoding more engaging and makes the retrieval more likely to match that encoding, which is somehow more vivid, more interesting, and more likely to be successful. So in general, when we're faced with boring information in the world, we have to use all of our senses to make things meaningful. So one example could be, if you're trying to remember what something tastes like, is to actually, you know, use your sense of smell, use your sense of taste, describe it. Like, this is a real yummy apple. It's really crisp and sweet and juicy. And so using all of our senses, our sense of taste, hearing, as well as saying something. So if someone says something to you, you say it back to them and say, this is a juicy apple. Yeah, you're right. This is a really tasty, juicy apple. And so then you have two different pathways for that memory. You've both heard it as well as you've said it out loud. And so the more pathways information has, the more likely it is to be remembered. And so make something new and engaging and interesting by using all of your senses. The other strategy we can use is this method of loci. And so I have a picture of a temple here. And so in Greek and Roman times, this is something people used to do, is that there used to be the job of the helper to the king is remember this information. And so before we had easier ways of writing things down or even taking a picture with our phones, it was up to someone to remember what the king was talking about. And in order to do so, they'd have to try to remember things as different locations around the palace. And so that's a particular memory strategy that memory experts use to try to use the method of loci, or the method of location, is to use our sense of vision or memory and be able to try to visualize information around a particular palace or house, and to try to use that to help our memory. So maybe if I have to remember to bring home chicken and cucumber and sausage, then I remember those as a chicken at my doorway, and a cucumber as I get into the bathroom, and a sausage as I enter the living room. And so just visualizing that information makes it more memorable. So let's test ourselves. So I'm putting up 12 words here, and what could be a way that we could take this information and make it more meaningful? So I'll give you guys a couple seconds just to look at it, because if I were to just blankly just look at it and say, okay, there's 12 words, I'm never going to remember it, the chances of me remembering that information is actually quite small. And so we need to apply some sort of strategy. So how can we be skillful? Okay, I'm looking at this for a while and I'm starting to notice, maybe some of these words are related. I notice maybe there's some animals, maybe there's some food, I'm getting hungry for lunch, maybe there's some musical instruments. Well, what if I remember them as there's different musical instruments, there's different food items, there's different animals. Okay, maybe that'll help me remember them. And so by doing that, we can create our own memory palaces by imagining maybe there's some musical instruments at the front of my house. Maybe there is some food items towards the living room. And then maybe there is some musical instruments again, maybe somewhere else. And so using different types of visualization strategies allows us to better remember that. And so maybe you imagine even a monkey holding a milkshake while playing guitar. And that allows you to make that information more engaging, more funny, more interesting. So either grouping the information or making it into a story or visualizing it around a place that you know well can be a good memory strategy. Another important memory strategy is just be mindful of where our attention goes. And so when we're not paying attention, there's a very little chance we're going to remember something. And so one basic memory strategy is just to note, when I'm distracted, I'm not going to remember well. So attention is a lot like a spotlight. Wherever you direct it is where you're going to have a chance of encoding information. And so using good memory strategies like writing information down or practicing good habits, that helps to supplement that. The other memory strategy that I think is important to talk about is retrieval practice. So sometimes we practice learning things, but we don't practice retrieving them. So if you have a big family reunion coming up and you want to remember whose kids goes with which adults or what my name of my third cousin is, it can be really challenging. And so one thing to do is to practice trying to retrieve that from your memory. And so maybe you look at your family tree and you say, okay, there's Uncle Stephen with his kids, William and Stephanie, and now I'm going to close that family tree, don't take a look at it, and see, can I pull that out of my own memory? Can I practice retrieving it? Which children go with Uncle Stephen? And you try to retrieve it yourself without looking, and if it's successful, that's great. And if it's unsuccessful, you go back and try to learn again and see if you can practice retrieving until you have a successful retrieval. Then over time, you can space out the retrieval. So maybe in a couple of minutes, you say to yourself, okay, let me see if I can successfully retrieve that information again. And so instead of just focusing on different ways of learning, retrieval practice can be really helpful to make sure you've learned something, but also that you're practice getting it out of memory. And so sometimes people ask me, they say, Dave, is it good to write things down? Is it good to have external memory aids? And I say, of course it is. It helps memory. So successful memory is actually good for memory. And so it doesn't make your memory weaker to use strategies. It actually makes it stronger. So if we break up some of the memory strategies, we can do things outside of our body or external memory aids. So a calendar, a list, a note, those are all things outside of our body. But we can also do things inside our brain or kind of in our mind. And so an example would be making sure we're paying attention. So I see something, I'm going to say it. So I've locked my door and I say it out loud. I've locked my door. It's March the 3rd. I don't need to call the dog walker and make sure to check my door. And so saying it out loud makes sure that you're engaging your attention. And then some of the things we've talked about are using some sort of meaningful encoding strategy. So can we elaborate the information? Can we tell a story about a monkey playing guitar while drinking a milkshake? Can we personalize it? So if we have to remember someone's name and their name is Rosie, and maybe we're trying to remember Rosie from Epilepsy Toronto, and maybe Rosie from Epilepsy Toronto has red hair. So we remember, okay, Rosie from Epilepsy Toronto has red hair. So that's how I'm going to remember that Rosie from Epilepsy Toronto is like a rose. She's like a red rose. We can use acronyms. So if I have to remember to bring home cucumbers, cauliflower, and chicken, I remember CCC. And that could be helpful. And I can use different type of mnemonic strategies like that method of loci to create a memory palace where I visualize things. I need to call back Carol today, so I visualize a phone on my door, and that reminds me I need to call back Carol. And so the goal of these strategies is to try to develop ways of targeting situations where you want to improve your memory. And any type of situation requires time to practice and get better and to notice how you're doing over time. So don't expect it to work right away, but maybe you could keep track at home and say, is this a good experiment? Is this strategy helping with the number of times I forget? And you can present some data to yourself and say, well, this helped 7 out of 10 times. And I would say, that sounds great. And that's helping 7 more times than it didn't. And so I want to just spend a little time on some of these factors that could affect memory. So we talked a little bit about strategies, but there are some things we know that could make memory worse. So medical disorders and diseases, and so things that happen to us or when we're not feeling well, those can affect memory and make memory weaker. And another factor is different medications. So beyond just memory, medications for epilepsy. We could also be on medications for how we're feeling. We could be on medications for sleep. We could be on medications for blood pressure. So we should be thinking with our medical teams, how can I be on the least amount of medications that don't make thinking bad? So we want to try to be on the fewest medications that we could be, but we don't want to stop taking medications or do something that's not good for our health. But if we have the choice, let's try and make our medications fewer and less of the medications that affect thinking skills. So one class of medications in particular that I'm critical about are sleeping medications. So sometimes we're frustrated, we really want to just conk out and fall asleep, and we'll take a medication that's helpful for sleep, whether it's over the counter or something prescribed. And most of those medications for sleep are also bad for our thinking skills. And so my recommendation is, if we're noticing trouble with our thinking skills, let's see if we can reduce the amount of sleep medications that we take and try more natural things, things like using strategies, such as using a cognitive behavioral therapy strategy, or a mindfulness strategy, or a meditation strategy, or using something more natural like melatonin, which is just our body's own sleep hormone. So if we can get away from medications that are dopey and make us feel tired, that's beneficial. One thing that we can do that's the most important thing for our memory is exercise. And so one client that I'm working with right now has noticed that she can find words much better now that she's exercising. And it's something I notice in my own life, that I feel better and I'm able to express myself better when I'm exercising. My memory is better and I'm thinking more clearly. Another factor that's more long term, you don't see more acute effects, it's more of a gradual thing, could be diet. And so if you're eating a diet that's low in bad stuff and high in good stuff, you'll notice the difference over time in terms of how well you're thinking, because we're creating a very nutritious, good environment for our brain. And so there's a very small separation between our brain and our body. And so however our body is feeling is reflected in how our brain is feeling. So in terms of eating well, there's a long-term benefit to how well our brain is thinking. Another important area to think about is stress and relaxation. So this year has been a very tough year for all of us, and in general, people have been complaining, I'm not thinking well or feeling well, and that's because we're all stressed out. It turns out living through a pandemic is a challenging thing, and it's on top of all of our other stressors in life. And so anytime we're feeling acutely stressed, such as, someone in school who has an examination, or someone in work who has a particular presentation, or something goes wrong, any reason for stress can make our brain not think as well, because our brains are old fashioned, and they don't think so well under pressure, because they have to produce this hormone called cortisol. And cortisol is really good for escaping a tiger in the Serengeti, but it's less good for the really precise type of thinking skills that we want to do, like coming up with someone's name or trying to remember a particular detail. That's less important for our survival. So our brain really prioritizes getting enough energy to escape from a tiger. And that's why when we're stressed out, this big bulky cortisol prevents us from learning new things. The best news about that is, as soon as the stress is removed, our thinking goes back to normal. And so if we can have a long-term practice for our own stress and relaxation, that's wonderful. And so doing something like yoga or meditation, or stretching, or breathing exercises, or talking to someone like Carol, those are all wonderful ways that we can work on our stress and improve our relaxation. And then doing different types of thinking activities, whether it's reading, going to a library, going to a museum, even learning something with a documentary that's interesting and engaging, those are all examples of thinking skills that actually improve our memory. So I'll just skip ahead to one slide here about neuroplasticity, and that's the fact that our brain is plastic. So our brain is able to be remolded. And what I mean by that is that the experiences we have in life change our brain. So we not only do bad things to our brain when we hurt our brain, we also do good things by exposing it to enriching learning opportunities, taking good care of it. And so when we have new experiences and we're having a nice relaxed brain and we're feeling good, that creates new pathways in our brain. And so our brain becomes healthier by having more pathways. So think of a transportation system with more roads in it. When our brain has more pathways, it can talk to each other better, talk to different parts of it better. And so if we're going to be doing things that create more pathways in our brain, we're going to be feeling better. So if I start to exercise and I notice that I'm thinking better, that's because I've created more pathways in my brain. Or if I've learned something and I'm feeling really excited, I've I'm learning because I've created new pathways in my brain that makes my brain talk to each other slightly differently. So one of the best things we can do for our thinking skills is to take good care of our body and to expose ourselves to good learning experiences. And so it's really, in terms of things we could do, I encourage people to think of a holistic approach to aging, to our mind and our body, and thinking of ourselves as one particular vessel. It's not that we have a separate brain and a separate body; they're connected. And so, how well our body is doing is often reflected in how well our brain is doing. And if we want our brain to do better, we should be thinking, how can I make my body feel better? And if we want our body to feel better, what can I do that makes my brain feel better? So they're not separate. I encourage people to think of them as one system. And a lot of the things that we can do for improving thinking are geared towards this body system. So with that, I'll turn it back to Carol because I want to make sure there's time for conversation. And so I'll keep my slides up just in case anyone has a question about a slide, but I'll pass it back to Carol so that if people have questions, Carol's going to kind of go through and pick out some questions for people.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Gold, for that excellent presentation. I'm hearing it for the second time, but I learned so much despite I heard it before. It's always good, a good refresher, for learning. And so I'm happy that you had the opportunity to offer it again. Thank you for doing that. What I'm going to do, I received some questions before, so I'm going to start with that first, and then I'll go to the chat box. So let me start. The first question, why does memory get bad when you have epilepsy? That's the first. And then why can memory improve after surgery? When a person has had a surgery for their epilepsy and had I don't know if this is a typo, AMYG. Um, it's quite three questions in one.
Yeah,
If you can address that, that would be
sure.
great.
And so, one thing we know about epilepsy is that there's both the seizures, so having any sort of seizure activity can disrupt thinking. So, remember, I put up a slide where we showed a symphony or we showed the network of the brain. Well, when that happens, when we are thinking about a network, anytime there's a disruption in the network, we're going to lose whatever we were working on. So if you think of your internet, as soon as you lose your internet connectivity, and what you were working on gets lost. And so unfortunately, when we have seizures, whatever we were thinking about or working on gets temporarily wiped out. And so sometimes after seizures, people say, I can't remember things from this week. I can't remember things from a couple of hours ago. And so that memory for more recent events is disrupted because it never got a chance to get stored. So think about a librarian who didn't have a chance to put the book away. She's never going to have a chance to find where she left it because she didn't put it away in a place where she knows where to look. And then over longer periods of time, it's general disruption in electrical activity, as well as the medications that work against memory. And so sometimes our patients who've been through epilepsy surgery become seizure free. And it's one of the great joys of my job to see people have that. And something they will report is that they're thinking better because they're on less medication, and they're thinking better because they're having less seizure activity. And so both of those factors make thinking better, and we notice improvement in things like our memory ability or finding words to express ourselves. And so that can be one of the nice things that happens with certain people with epilepsy surgery. And so that would be my explanation as to how epilepsy impacts memory and why surgery can be helpful for some people.
Thank you. What I'm going to do too, I think I'm going to read from the form that person submitted, and I'll check the chat box at the same time, just so I give everybody a fair chance at asking their questions. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to also add the evaluation form, so you can fill that out while listening to the answers that Dr. Gold is going to be offering. So I've just sent the feedback form. So if you can fill that out in the meantime, that'll be great. So the next question, uh, hmm, the next question is, what brain exercises do you recommend to improve memory? Are there any apps that you would recommend in getting our brain in the optimum level? And so they're asking, for example, PEC or lumosity.
Hmm. So that's a great question. And there's no one brain application that contributes to better memory. And so they've looked at these in different studies, and doing the types of thinking tasks that they ask you to do make you better at the thinking task. So some of those apps that you listed in the question, they practice different types of thinking skills that we measure in our neuropsychology clinic. Things like how well you can connect dots to each other, how well you can search for things, how well you can remember things. And if you practice those things, you get better at them, but it doesn't translate or transfer into different thinking skills in your life. And so instead, what I think is more beneficial is to have particular thinking skill goals that are more activities you enjoy. And then you get better at those activities, and it transfers into more satisfaction in your life. So things like doing crossword puzzles or Sudoku, things like learning a new musical instrument, things like learning a couple words in a new language, things like learning a new dance move or learning a new approach to how to do something. Like, for instance, if you enjoy artwork, learn how to do a different portrait style. Or if you enjoy sports, learn how to hit a ball in a different way. Those are all examples of engaging your thinking skills, but you're doing it to learn and practice in a way that's important for your life. So, if I were to make a recommendation, if you're a reader, continue to read. If you enjoy learning with documentaries, challenge yourself to learn with documentaries. Whatever way that you enjoy using your thinking skills, challenge yourself to do new things within that area so that you're continually growing and learning. And so your brain has to grow and learn too in order to accommodate those new experiences. So, if you enjoy learning about things and the world, well, once we're able to travel again, it's wonderful to travel and learn about different cultures and learn about different places in a city, because that's good for your thinking skills. You have to both learn information, you have to use your thinking abilities of decision making. So a lot of good thinking skills go into everyday thinking abilities. We just have to make sure we're challenging ourselves to learn more and doing something that makes us feel like we're growing, because our brain has to change in order to accommodate that growth.
Thank you. Can seizures affect memory of one's life experiences, and are these memory gaps in an indication of autobiographical disorder?
So that is a wonderful and very sophisticated question. And so episodic memory is a type of memory for episodes in a life, or events in the world. And a very particular type of that type of memory is autobiographical memory. And so that's the memory for the episodes of our life. And for people with epilepsy, that can be one of the most frustrating thing is, I want to recall this event. We went on this beautiful vacation and I can't recall it. Or this really funny thing happened and I can't recall it. And so that type of memory disruption is frustrating, and it's most common in temporal lobe epilepsy. And the one thing we can do to try to help with that is to make our events very deliberate and very rich, so that when we're experiencing something, like let's say we want to remember the event of eating an apple, we say, this is a beautiful Honeycrisp apple. It's sweet, it's tasty, it's juicy. I'm going to remember it because of how delicious it is. And you say to someone else, let's take a picture in our mind of this moment. So you've got multiple ways to encode it. It's deliberate, it's rich. You tell a story about that apple. Even though that doesn't guarantee you'll remember it, that makes it more likely. And so it's a frustrating thing, and I wish we had a technology or a medication that could help with it. But memory for autobiographical details is something we haven't yet figured out how to rehabilitate. And the best thing I can offer is to try to make information richer and more meaningful so that you can have a better chance of recalling it.
Thank you. What type of meditation would you recommend as being the best way to manage or recover from epilepsy, given there are so many insight meditation, transcendental medication, meditation, mantra meditation, relaxation response, etc.?
That's a wonderful question. And I would say whatever meditation makes you feel good is the right medication. Meditation, not medication. It is a type of medication. So, just to cover a little bit about meditation, if you're able to do something involving your body, so a body scan where during the process of a meditation, you're able to visualize different parts of your body, such as your feet, and then you travel up to your calves and you envision your thighs and then your torso and your upper chest and your head. If you're doing a body scan based activity, that's actually really helpful for recovery from seizures because it reminds your body that it's safe, that you're in control, and that you can feel some sense of calmness in your body. And so I like things that are body based. But people have very different responses to different types of meditation. So, mantra based meditation, where you repeat a particular phrase or saying, some people find that to be wonderful. Whereas other people find that to feel a little gimmicky and it doesn't feel good for them. So I would encourage people to be their own scientists and find what feels good for me. And we know over time having a consistent meditation practice can make your brain look younger. So if we stick someone in a scanner who's been meditating for a year and another person who's just been living their life for the year, that person who's been meditating, their brain will look younger and be more reflexive. It'll be more able to respond to different things in the world when we need it to. It'll feel sharper. And so, my take home message about meditation is that it's not for everyone, but even if you can force yourself to do it, kind of like taking your vitamins and just say, I'm going to try this, I'm going to give it the best shot because I know the research really, really, really supports it. I would say if you can do some research and just go on YouTube and find different free videos or different approaches or read a book about it, it can be one of the most beneficial things for brain health of the things that you can do in your daily life.
And at 13 years post-op, can we expect cognitive abilities to continue to improve? What activities would help to promote improvement?
So that's a great question. So the brain naturally recovers the most in 1 year following any sort of event. So if you have a head injury or a stroke or surgery, in that first year after, our brain does the most healing. But our brain is always changing. So if you give yourself healthy experiences of learning, exercise, stress reduction, social activities, your brain can continue to stay healthy and not get sick. So I would say even 13 years post-operatively, try challenging yourself to learn something new, learn a new musical instrument, learn a new approach, learn about a new area of the world. Any type of learning activity combined with exercise, combined with social activities, those are all things that are very good for brain health. And if you want to continue to notice good thinking skills, I would recommend considering those.
What metric can be used to determine your current memory and see how things have improved over a period?
That's a wonderful question. So sometimes we ask the people who know you really well, because if you have to comment on your own memory, sometimes we're not the best judge. So maybe we would ask someone who knows you well. So maybe an adult child or a partner or a family friend. But in general, if you want to be really precise and get percentages in there, then someone like me would be able to do that by saying, okay, let's give you tests of these thinking abilities, see how well you do, and be able to get some precision in your memory and other thinking skills so that if there is a change or you feel like something's getting better or something's getting worse, we're able to say with some precision, I think your memory is, 5 or 10% weaker, or I think your processing speed has improved.
Do individuals with epilepsy have significant impairment, memory loss, and ability to retain new information?
No, not necessarily. So there are some people with epilepsy who are functioning wonderfully and they don't have any changes in their thinking skills. And some of my patients who are sickest from epilepsy will have substantial difficulties and be unable to learn new information well. And so there's a big continuum, and for each different type of person, there's a different barrier for challenges with thinking skills. So some of the people I work with who are the most anxious, they have a different reason for having trouble with their thinking skills, whereas some of my patients who have 15, 20 seizures a day, there would be a different reason for their difficulty with thinking skills. So because each person is different, we would give custom advice about what kind of challenges you have and what kind of strategies would be most helpful to help you achieve your goals.
Are there any exercises in particular that will help with word finding?
That is a great question. And so there is no particular strategy, but if you find that you're thinking around a word and you're trying to come up with a word and you can't quite come to it, I encourage people to think about a similar word. So if you're trying to think of a particular word, and let's say the word is champagne, and you can't think of it, try to think of a similar word like bubbly alcohol or fizzy or something that reminds you of champagne, and that can cue the word. Another strategy is to actually think about a word that's similar based on how it sounds or what it does. And so if I'm thinking I can't think of the word champagne, but I know it starts with a sh sound, then it's okay to use a phonetic strategy or how something sounds to try to cue your memory. So you could say to yourself, is it an a sound, b sound, sh? Oh, it is that ch sound. That can also help cue your memory. But in general, the best thing you can do is not panic and not slam your foot on the brake, so to speak, and just take a breath. And most oftentimes, the word that you're looking for will come to you. And so, getting anxious and getting upset is not the way to go, but try to either think of a similar word that cues your memory, you try to think of how it sounds, or just be patient and know that it'll come back to you.
How much more predisposed are epileptics to seizures or concussions when participating in activities that may expose the participants to head trauma, such as judo?
Wow, that is a great question. So it would be a difficult study to run because we don't typically give people head injuries. And so an individual with epilepsy would be at risk for a head injury the same way another person would, but it might be more challenging for them to recover from that head injury. So because we have a vulnerability with the brain having a propensity for epilepsy, that person should be working extra hard to do things safely. So I would not recommend a combat sport. I would recommend more of a movement-based activity, and I would recommend something that doesn't have the possibility for head trauma. So if it was my child, I would say, instead of thinking about boxing or karate, can we think about Tai Chi or tennis, something where there's less likelihood of a head injury?
Thank you, Dr. Gold. I don't see any other questions, and I don't have any more in my form. Um, so I don't know if anyone has any other questions, or we can close off for today. Um, and please remember to fill out the evaluation forms. Your responses are very important. It would help us to make more informed decisions about upcoming workshops in the future. Okay, so I think Dr. Gold, that's all the questions I have. Just let me make certain that, oops, uh, okay, I just, okay. So that's it for today. Thank you all for attending this workshop. I hope you learned a lot. I certainly did. Thank you, Dr. Gold, for presenting again. And just look out for the recording. It would be posted on our webpage at a later date. So thank you.
Okay, thanks for inviting me, Carol. Thank you, everyone,
You're
for
most
participating.
welcome.